Today I'll be demonstrating my method for fixing the hinge on my CR-48 prototype Chromebook. I'll also be swapping out my broken screen for a new one, and in general, I'll be doing a full disassembly. You of course start by taking all the screws out, then use like a guitar pick or something to remove the bottom cover from the rest of the computer. I'm gonna pop out the old mSATA 16GB SSD because I'll be replacing it with a larger one. I'm speeding through most of this footage, otherwise the video would be like 2 hours long, but in general, the disassembly is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. Now I start popping the bezel off the screen, but you can't take it off completely unless you remove the round black part at the bottom. Both that and the bezel in general are attached via clips, so be like really careful when you take that off because you're gonna break some of the clips, like I did. You could probably replace the screen without taking it off the hinges, but I'm gonna take the whole thing apart anyway. Just try and make sure you keep the lid as closed as you can while taking this apart. The reason for this will become apparent later. So I'll just be taking everything apart now, and I'll start by removing the wireless cards. Make sure you note down the orientation of the antenna cables going into the cards. For me it would be a Hinge red, blue, black, white. That's the color of the label only. Make sure you note this down yourself because it might be different on your computer. I didn't catch it in the video here, but the display connector next to the left hinge is very fragile and you need to pull it out upwards away from the board. And the keyboard ribbon is on the bottom of the motherboard, so be careful with that. As you can see, the CPU is just using a heat pad, which is insane, but whatever. So now I'll remove the keyboard part of the computer, and we're left with just the screen. Gonna pop off that black round bit now, which exposes the 3 screws that are still holding on the bezel. I'll take a closer look at these hinges in a sec, but for now I'll just remove the remaining screws that are holding on the screen. This right here is the reason why the CR-48 has issues with the hinges. As you can see, the problem isn't actually the hinges themselves, it's actually the brittle ABS/polycarbonate plastic molding that attaches the hinge to the lid. Make sure you do not unscrew the screws in these hinges because it might break even more than it already is. And it should be apparent that when you're reassembling the whole computer, you don't over tighten any of the screws. So now I'm going to show you my method of fixing the hinge problem. This might not exactly be a perfect fix, but it's certainly going to be better than it is now. I believe the hinge problem is also the reason why the screens break on this thing so often. So you're going to need a couple of things, some epoxy. There's probably better kinds than what I'm using, especially ones that have like rubber bits to make it stronger, but this is just normal epoxy. You'll need some clamps, and I'm going to be using vice grips. And you're also maybe going to need some of these plastic syringes. You can get these at Tractor Supply for like $4. These are 5 or 6 cc's, which is plenty for this. You probably also want to wear gloves for this and do it outside because the hardener stinks insanely bad. So I'm going to mix up some epoxy. I made like a quarter-size blobs. You could probably use a little bit more, but I ended up having a pretty decent amount in the end. After this is mixed, I'm going to try and scrape as much of it as I can into the back of the syringe. The reason I'm using a syringe is because it kind of lets me like squirt the epoxy into the inside of the broken bits of plastic where the screws go into. The camera work here is crap, but what I'm doing is pressing down on the metal hinge bit that would connect into the other part of the computer. This is going to lift up the broken part of the hinge, and then I'm going to squirt half the epoxy into that area. I do the same for the other side, and then I'm going to take a little bit of cardboard and shove it up against the area to try and keep it from flowing out. If you were smarter than me, you might pre-cut out some cardboard dams that perfectly fit and shape the epoxy, but this is fine enough. I'll then take my vice grips and apply some pressure onto the hinges. Again, if you were smarter, you would put some cardboard bits on each side so you don't hurt the lid, but it's whatever. This is the hardest part. You kind of gotta get the 2 angles of the hinge exactly correct, so that way your lid goes back on straight. And if you clamp down too tight, you might end up breaking more plastic, so be careful with that. But anyway, you want to keep these on the entire time the epoxy's curing. Periodically, I'm going to come in with this small bit of plastic to kind of scrape the epoxy back into place as it's starting to solidify. So a couple of hours later, you should be good to go and you'll have something like this. If you notice, one of my sides is actually a little bit lower because I had more clamping pressure on it, but it's whatever, it's fine. So now on to replacing the screen. It's pretty straightforward. Here's the old screen and you can see it's wrapped in this metal foil. Now really this stuff isn't necessary at all, but I want at least the rear foil still to maintain the spacing on the new screen somewhat. You could use scissors and do this correctly, but I'm just going to make some slices and kind of rip it off as best as I can. Suppose now I'll show you the exact panel you need to replace the screen in this. It's a Samsung LTN 121AT10. Just Google that and you'll find some results. I guess I'll shout out the eBay seller I got my replacement from, VR Assets. It was only 16 bucks, but that's kind of a lucky deal, and I suspect the supply on these are not that great. Occasionally you can find broken CR-48s on eBay for pretty cheap, so it might just be better to cannibalize parts from those to make yours a bit nicer. A year or so ago, I actually saw someone selling an entire pallet of CR-48s for insanely cheap, but I didn't buy it. Though someone did, or maybe they just got sent to a landfill. Who knows? Anyway, the only thing left to do is reassembly. There's a few mistakes and weird things I did during reassembly that I'll point out though. Again, sorry for the bad camera work here. I'm pretty limited in my environment. My camera is like actually touching the ceiling where it's sitting because of my goofy slanty roof. So the first thing you're going to struggle with is putting back together the attaching keyboard ribbon. You got to make sure the little white plastic bit on the connector is pulled out enough so you can actually push the ribbon in. And now I'm going to try to affix the screen hinges back to the keyboard part of the computer. Remember when I said to try and keep the lid as closed as possible? Well, I didn't really do that, so now I'm going to lift the keyboard to align the hinges and screw it in a bit. One important thing to note here is that on the left hinge, the display connector needs to be coming out from under the hinge, but it's not actually under it, it kind of goes around it. It's hard to explain, so just be careful you don't hurt the super fragile wires. And remember, this thing goes in from the top. So now I begin screwing every other screw back in its place. One thing I messed up is that I put a screw into the hinge holes that are closest to the edge of the computer. These are the holes that have a little X next to them, and there's one on each side of the computer. These actually get screwed into with the long screws that go under the rubber feet from the outside of the computer. As you'll see, I try and check the voltage of the CMOS battery on my multimeter, but for whatever reason I couldn't read a voltage from the pads that I think were connecting to the motherboard, so I end up just shoving the probes in the plastic wrap. Well, I still could only get a voltage reading of like half a volt, which is really weird, but I decided to just say fuck it, and it's pretty trivial to rig up a new battery for these kind of connectors. You just rip off the contacts from the old battery and tape them to a new one and it'll just work. So now you'll see me trying to route the antenna cables and attach the trackpad, the Bluetooth antenna, and the cooling fan. It's kind of a pain to try and get the antenna cables connected to the Wi-Fi card while it's still plugged into the motherboard for some reason, so I go and remove it and then attach the antennas to the card. I then take a little tape and wrap the other two antennas up just so they don't contact anything since I'm removing the 3G modem. Also notice I'm not plugging in the webcam/mic connector, which is on the bottom right of the motherboard next to the PCI slot that the 3G modem was installed in. Next, I'm actually installing the original 16GB drive into this PCIe slot, but before you get excited, let me just tell you this didn't work. The drive wasn't recognized at all, so big deal, didn't need that dying 16GB drive anyway. Mini PCIe does use the same connector as mSATA, but they're not actually compatible all the time. It seems there's some options in the BIOS that might maybe allow you to use one of these as a second mSATA slot, but I'm not totally sure about that. Though I suppose there's nothing stopping you from plugging in some kind of PCIe drive or adapter for a second drive. On the topic of upgrades, the CR-48 uses a pretty standard for the time stick of RAM, but the Intel Atom CPU only supports 2GB of RAM, so don't even bother. As I'm putting this thing back together, I'll do some minor adjustments to the hinge. You'll see the lid is not fully staying closed. It's kind of hovering open, so I'm taking some pliers to the actual hinge mechanism, and I'm kind of forcing it to rotate itself a little bit more. This helped a bit, but it wasn't perfect at first, but after using the computer for a few days, opening and closing the lid, it's become pretty much perfect, which you'll see at the end of the video. One big mistake I made here at the end is I neglected to reroute the speaker cable into its little rubber holder things, so that caused the screws on the bottom of the computer to not want to fit in, and there was like a bump where the battery would go in, which caused the battery to not fit in at all. So I had to take the whole thing apart again after the video to fix that, but I decided to test everything first. That cable, for whatever reason, pushing against the computer also made half the keyboard not work. and it fixed itself after I just rerouted the cable, so I don't know what was going on there. But as you can see, the new computer boots up and the new screen works. My hinge alignment isn't totally perfect, but it's pretty good. The lid's pretty closed on the computer, though it's a little tiny bit up on the one side. One important bit of info to know is that if you have UEFI boot enabled and not legacy, you're not going to get video output on certain Linux installers after the grub screen. I'm currently running Duvan Linux on this, but I really have no use for this computer. I used and really abused the crap out of this thing in the last 12 years I've had it, and I'm planning on making a much more properly shot, retrospective type video showcasing this computer and my history with it. So make sure you get subscribed so you don't miss that.